The American embassy in Cuba has reopened after 54 years. US Secretary of State John Kerry raised an American flag at the symbolic ceremony in Havana.
I feel at home here because this is truly a memorable occasion. A day for pushing aside old barriers and exploring new possibilities.
Relations between the two countries, however, still have a long way to go. A day earlier, the former Cuban president, Fidel Castro, insisted that the US owes Cuba millions of dollars in compensation for a 53-year-old trade embargo, which is still in place. But American corporations think that it's Cuba who must pay. After the diplomatic split, Cuba nationalized Western assets, most of which were American. Since then, US corporations have submitted almost 6,000 compensation claims to a special committee in Washington. At the time, the assets were worth about $2 billion. Roll on to 2015, and that sum would now be about $7.5 billion. President Obama says that relations with Cuba are not certain to improve in the future, despite America's best efforts.
That doesn't mean that over the next 2 years, we can't anticipate them taking certain actions that we may end up finding deeply troubling, either inside of Cuba or with respect to their foreign policy. And that could put significant strains on the relationship.
Some US presidential candidates strongly oppose Obama's initiative to reset relations with Cuba. Lindsey Graham calls the normalization of relations with Cuba a bad idea at a bad time. Bobby Jindal says that this rewards American enemies, while Ted Cruz called the move a very, very bad idea. Now, to discuss this further, I'm joined live by Daniel Shaw, who's Professor of Latin American and Caribbean Studies at the City University of New York. Thanks so much for coming on RT. The reopening of the US Embassy, do you think this is a genuine and significant attempt to improve relations, or is it merely just something symbolic?
I would say that the tactics of the United States have changed, but the strategy is the same. It is very significant that the U.S. flag went up today in Havana. How much more significant would it be if the U.S. flag over Guantanamo Bay finally came down after 117 years of colonial occupation?
Who do you think will benefit most? We've heard about the claims and counterclaims financially, but overall, who benefits most from a reset in relations?
Well, certainly U.S. corporations are drooling at the possibility of tapping into a market of 11 million people, only 90 miles off the coast of Florida. But the Cuban leadership has weathered many storms, and they will surely know how to weather this storm. So it looks like it could be beneficial on both ends, but we are confident that the Cuban leadership will know how to not use this as a step back, but to advance forward.
Why is removing the embargo such an important thing for Havana?
The embargo has been extremely cruel for the last 53 years. It has isolated Cuba from many trade opportunities. The United States has not just blockaded Cuba, but any country in the world who dared to try to trade with Cuba, trying to create Cuba as a pariah of international status. So removing the blockade will free up Cuba to tap into different markets and trade with whoever is most beneficial for them.
Keeping embargoes in force, it often takes cooperation. If the US decides to keep it in place, does it have the international backing to do so?
It has never had the international backing. It has never had the backing of international law, United Nations. It's completely unilateral. The only country in the United Nations that have ever supported the U.S. blockade has been Israel. The other 190 some odd members of the UN have been 100% against it. But like many things in international law, because U.S. imperialism supports it, it has stood.
Now, we've heard several candidates for the US presidency speaking on the issue. They've criticised the proposed improvement in relations. Under these circumstances, what do you think the prospects are for actually lifting the embargo?
Well, there's definitely a strong right-wing movement that would want to continue suffocating and isolating Cuba. These are the same individuals who are waging war right now against the Syrian people, against the people of Ukraine. So Cuba is going to have to stay very alert and spin on a dime and respond to whatever policy comes into place, because it really remains to be seen how the U.S. Congress or the future Democratic or Republican candidate could shift U.S. policy towards Cuba.
Daniel, thanks so much for speaking to us. That's Daniel Shaw, Professor of Latin American and Caribbean Studies at the City University of New York. Thanks again.
Okay.